Hi there, everybody. I'm Alec Hogg. With me is Bronwyn Nielsen, my colleague from CNBC Africa, and Dr. Martin Davies from Frontier Advisory. And we're having a look back on Davos 2015. Without any further ado, Bron, you were one of the stars of the show. I know that you probably haven't heard this one before, but your panel discussion on Africa was fascinating, was discussed a lot afterwards. But how do you feel? How do you actually feel before you go into that event, which is broadcast live and being watched by, well, hundreds of the most powerful people in the world in the audience?
Alec, thanks very much, and thanks for the compliment at the outset. It is a very big stage. As you point out, it's a global stage, and this is the third time that I've hosted that debate in the forum. And people say 2 days before, I've done a little tally with my colleagues. 2 days beforehand, they know not to speak to me or to engage with me. Directly after the debate, I turn into a real person again. So the challenge is absolute focus. It is about going into that debate knowing that you're going to be sitting with your president, obviously President Jacob Zuma. He was also alongside President Paul Kagame of Rwanda. And the challenge is in that preparation to get as many facts and figures and nuances around the African continent that when that conversation unfolds, you can pick up on elements and bring that debate to life. So I think, Alec, you and I have discussed extensively that hosting a debate is not about having a written list of questions, but it's really about being able to pinpoint the highlights. I don't know if you want to go on, shall I go on before we introduce Martin? There's two highlights perhaps I can refer to, which will give you some color as to the stress that I go through as the moderator on that stage. Do you want me to proceed?
Yeah, please.
So I think the first one was, and it was a big challenge in terms of how I was going to put to President Jacob Zuma, being a South African citizen, the fact that South Africa, with its growth rate of 1.4% in 2014 and heading to 2.2% in 2015, is a drastic drag on the overall Africa growth story. So I had to, and I positioned that in a manner where I actually just acknowledged, as a South African citizen, I don't want to ask you this question. As a journalist, I have to ask you the question. So that was the first point, and you then get the audience's attention because they know that you're prepared to ask the uncomfortable questions. The second one, which I knew I had to ask, and which I was quite nervous that either Paul Kagame or President Jacob Zuma were going to cancel ahead of the debate, because this is one of the first stages they had shared since the diplomatic incident between Rwanda and South Africa that took place in 2014. And I was waiting for a segue from either President Zuma or President Kagame to go in on that point. And President Zuma gave it to me about 35 minutes into the debate. He started talking about collaborative leadership on the African continent and why it was so important that they work together. As he said that, I said, talking about collaborative leadership, Mr. President, we know about the diplomatic tensions between Rwanda and South Africa in 2014. This is not the right stage to discuss those, but it is the right stage to ask you about economic relations between the two countries and how those tensions impacted those economic tensions. I then was a little cheeky, and I had this all planned, and there was a little bit of sort of shifting in the chairs between Kagame and President Zuma. And then I said, I turned to the audience and I said, I suppose, gentlemen, I should have asked that question before I seated you next to one another. So that's just a little bit about the nuances.
Yeah, and really, Martin, you've been to Davos a number of times. They don't suffer fools in those audiences, and the questions are focused and hard-hitting. And I guess Bronwyn did have, I'm not surprised she didn't sleep for a night or two beforehand.
Well, good for Bronwyn, that's what I say. I think Davos, World Economic Forum, often people tend to, maybe Davos is different from our regional summits, but often the panelists and the speakers tend to pussyfoot around issues perhaps, but good for Bronwyn for asking the tough questions. And as you say, like it brings together phenomenal people with great ideas. The supposed people for the most part, people run the world supposedly, and it really is quite an intense place in more ways than one. Intellectually stimulating, very tiring. It's just unbelievably the networking opportunities unprecedented anywhere in the world, and it certainly does bring together people who count and can shape the future of our world, and that's the mission of World Economic Forum.
There's a lot of work that goes into it beforehand, which I think people don't quite understand. Martin, you were part of the Young Global Leaders program for a few years. From that perspective, did you not just network, but actually expand your horizons, expand your learning by engaging with others in the same program?
It's very hard, Alec, to explain it until you've actually experienced it. I'm part of the Young Global Leaders Network, as you say, and soon to be perhaps the Young Global Leaders Alumni Group. And the World Economic Forum is it's just constant communities. So there's global agenda councils, there's over 80 of those which are specializing in key themes, which meet on the sidelines of regional summits, of which there are 5 or 6 a year. They meet every year in the UAE. There's YGL communities, there's Shapers community, younger people, doing things to improve the state of the world. It's a very, very complex onion, if you will, of layered communities that make up a forum. All of which, throughout the course of the year preceding Davos and the regional summits, there's consultations, there's conversations, there's telephone calls, there's webinars, there's physical meetings. The forum people from Geneva often come to see us and consult and ask questions. What's most important for you, and how do we feed this into the agenda at Davos? And that gives them the content, the ideas to shape these discussions. So yes, it's networking, but it's in a very intellectually stimulating environment as well, and it's totally not sort of commercial like many, dare I say, many sort of US or American style conferences would be. So it's a serious place for serious people.
And I guess, Bron, that's the thing that kind of gets me up in the morning when I go there, is that I know that I'm talking to people who really know their oats. They understand world issues because they've been fed that information. Perhaps just before we move off Africa, I felt that in previous years, Africa was a lot more in focus than it was this year. Outside of your debate, there wasn't really that much of a high-profile positioning of the continent. What was your feeling on that?
I agree, and I think that that's got a lot to do with the fact that the Nigerian delegation wasn't there. Nigeria has been out in full force in prior years, and obviously on the GDP revision last year, they capitalized on that as being the biggest economy in Africa. They are headed for their elections in just a week now, so that was why there was very little Nigerian representation. However, Oscar Onyema, the CEO of the Nigerian Stock Exchange, was there carrying the banner for the country. And we also had John Kumantaris, who is Flour Mills Nigeria PLC, who were operating in Nigeria and also took a position on the panel. Alec, I think that also the lot of interest is because maybe South Africa or Africa's story is not as robust as it was a couple of years ago. I mean, you're competing, and this was one of the issues that I raised with Brand South Africa at that function. We had a function ahead of, in one of the evenings at the Kirshner Museum, in that we are competing with other emerging markets like China, that is growing at 7.3, 7.4%, India at 6.8%. Our story at 5.2% muted is not actually that bright. And particularly with South Africa being the second largest economy at 1.4%, there's not that much to write home about. So I think you say that the investors there really know their oats. I agree with you. And I think we've got to understand the level of sophistication, and that our underpin to the excitement around Africa is a good growth story, and ours is potentially waning.
Now, I like that point about the sophistication, because sometimes I feel that, particularly with people who are going there for the very first time, they just don't get it. They're trying to sell a story that is almost like a PR story that, unfortunately, in that caliber of audience, doesn't wash. But I'd be interested to get your thoughts on the whole BRICS story. I see this morning that Jim O'Neill from the old Goldman Sachs guy was asked whether B or the Brazilians should be dropped from BRIC. He's never actually added South Africa into the BRICS We hear undertones of South Africa not getting on that well with China anymore. In Davos this year, Russia was isolated as the key villain. Of course, Putin didn't arrive. The Brazilian president didn't arrive either. So, and that was a place, Davos was a place when the BRICS actually came together in the past and showed a united front. Is it fragmenting?
Look, I think 2015, Alec, is the year of geopolitics. I think it was certainly the backbone in 2013, 2014, and clearly South Africa in the last few years has we've certainly, through rhetoric and through action, aligned ourselves with BRICS economy and added ourselves as a capital letter as opposed to a small apostrophe S. But I think this year it's going to be, the last 2 times I was in Davos, the Brazilians, the Indians respectively were both sponsoring big cultural evenings, certainly not this time. And countries like the BNR and BRICS especially are under significant pressure. I think South Africa arguably needs to rethink this. Russia, I'd be surprised, and this is a strong statement, if Russia gets through this year, 2015, without without the country going bankrupt, effectively, considering short-term dollar-denominated debts and particularly the plunging ruble environment. Brazil is in a sort of a deep malaise. Structural reforms are required, not too dissimilar to ourselves, to be honest. I think we have the potential to be agile, but we're certainly not. And just as an aside, and as Bronwyn said, this is a very emerging market need to compete for attention in this new global political economic order. South Africa, first and foremost, I think certainly needs to realize that. Last week announced that Myanmar, for example. Now Myanmar is a traditionally very closed economy, size of the population, but attracting $5 billion in investment this year alone, $5 billion US, and that's Myanmar. How much is South Africa attracting beyond the portfolio flow? So I was saying, I think in a conversation recently, what would get investors' attention more than anything else for South Africa is a 5% growth rate. I think the rhetoric, the plans, the sort of stories which are becoming, as Bronwyn's phrase, waning perhaps, I think is certainly true. The honeymoon 20 years, if we haven't realized it by now, is certainly over. And nothing would speak more forcibly in Davos if we were getting 5, 6, or perhaps even more % GDP growth. That's what this country really needs.
Yeah, it's I suppose talking about the money buys the whiskey, there, Brian.
I mean, I just want to add to what Martin is saying, and again on this infrastructure theme, which is prevalent every single Davos. For me, that is where the foreign direct investment opportunities lie. We know, and we didn't touch on this, Alec, I don't know if you got any questions around the electricity crisis we are facing in South Africa at the moment, and that basically pegs our top growth rate, to Martin's point of saying we need a 5%. With the electricity concerns and the crisis that we're experiencing, we can only achieve a 3% growth rate, if that. There is no way in the current environment we can go for 5%. So infrastructure, an enormous theme, and I think what I would do if I was running public relations for the country or even for the continent, I would go in there with a sheet that's put out the tough issues that we're facing, and I would confront investors with those rather than waiting for them to ask us. And I would have very robust answers to the difficult questions. I don't want to sit on another platform. I mean, I go back to Abuja, to the World Economic Forum, which was held in Abuja in Nigeria. And on that platform, I had Finance Minister Gatete from Rwanda, then Finance Minister of South Africa, Pravin Gordhan, and the current Minister of Finance out of Nigeria, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. And we discussed at that forum, let's just do one thing that we execute on. And I asked for the free movement of goods, services, and people across the African continent. I had a strong representation from South, from East, and from West. And for me, 6 months on, we're still talking about the same discussion in Davos. We still don't have, yes, the East African community has moved to a single visa environment, but it takes collaborative leadership across the African continent to solve some of these issues that we can demonstrate visible traction to outside investors.
No, those are really good points. I guess for me the big thing about Davos is that it takes people from isolated environments and puts them into a global fishbowl where they not only are being looked at, but where they can engage with others and get lessons from other countries. Perhaps the most forceful one of those was, and Bronwyn and I, Martin, are on the International Media Council, where we get to talk to prime ministers and leaders from various parts of the world. And Matteo Renzi from Italy was there. And he's a young man. He just turned 40, in fact, the week before Davos. And he was telling us how he'd been elected to be Prime Minister of Italy because he's not a career politician. He's got a 5-year term maximum. What he has to do is to address labour legislation, inflexible labour laws, which have taken Italy for the last 20 years to zero growth and a trebling of their national debt. Now, if I look at Ibrahim Patel and Rob Davies, who were there, perhaps even Jacob Zuma, and if they're exposed to these kind of people, there's got to be some kind of an impact, surely, Martin, on the way they see things when they come home.
Look, I think just 2 points. We have a synchronized growth decade, even 2008 decade, to understand things post 2008, 2009. Now, really, we're living in a very we have to work like pre-2008, where we did.
So we kind of live. Sorry, man, we're losing you. Would you mind just maybe switching off your video for a minute, and perhaps then the audio will come through a little clearer.
How's that?
Okay, give it a go.
Yeah, I think, like I was saying, is that this decade was made a very synchronized growth, a rising growth. We're growing pretty robustly. I think now it's living in a multi-speed world. In South Africa, I'm afraid, isn't so no lane. So, correct is agile states, governments that can want to change in a rapid fashion. I think you hope that our ministers, I think our business guys certainly. The question is, why is our government, the ministers you mentioned, our government departments, so non-responsive to this global, rapidly changing environment? That's the key question. Ultimately, the state has become too unreal, lacking agility, the capability to turn itself very quickly to adapt. And I think this lack of agility is often an ideological world that is obsolete and very unsuited to positioning the country in a relatively robust, strong growth environment that is essential. In this multi-speed world, I can say, and I would strongly argue that the outgoing editor of The Economist magazine said last week that ultimately free market minds will win, and I think he's correct.
Yeah, well, it was a bit difficult to follow most of that, Martin, but I think I get the gist. Bron, just from your perspective, and you interview a lot of public officials and leaders from all over the continent. Do you think that they changed their minds after Davos, after being exposed to other points of view?
Again, Alec, I'm still looking for the tangibles out there. So have I seen it demonstrated in policy post-discussion in terms of saying, promising something on a Davos stage and then implementing it at home? I haven't seen that. I haven't seen an example of that happen over the last 3 years that I've been going to Davos. I try and call politicians to account and say, remember when we sat on this stage last year, this is what you said. So perhaps one element where they do change their thinking, and I'm not sure that this is a positive, is that you come back with a lot of African leaders, and I'm talking more about the politicians here than the private sector delegation, saying that, well, things are so bad in the rest of the world that it's actually not as bad on the African continent or in South Africa. I find that a lot in a number of the discussions as well. Perhaps we shouldn't focus on South Africa because look at what's happening in Paris, or look at what is happening in Belgium. And I don't find that a suitable argument. You can't. deflect attention from yourself by saying, well, look at how bad it is over there. So that's probably the conversation that I've picked up on most, in that, you know, and to the broader themes of economic inclusion and job creation. When we address those situations on the African continent, I do find ministers, again, deflecting and saying, well, this is not just an African problem or a South African problem. It is a global problem. I don't know if that answers your question. I'm a bit cynical on whether they come back and change their minds.
Yeah, you certainly are. I just think that whenever people are exposed to another point of view, it helps them to, any human being, it helps them to even just process things in their own minds. They might not immediately change it. And that's one of the concerns that I had about our President Jacob Zuma. You know, when he went there for the first time in 2009, this was just after Polokwane, he arrived there as a man that the media really wanted to lynch. I mean, here's this chap from darkest Africa with a string of wives, who's got a very controversial past, who's going to be the next president of the country, who clearly doesn't have the educational background that one would anticipate from a mid-range economy. And he disarmed everybody with his charm. He was really charming by saying, I've come here to learn. This time around, what was disappointing was, I'm not sure that he allowed himself, or his handlers allowed himself to be exposed towards the learning processes. And maybe that's half the problem, is that these leaders who should be coming back after saying less and listening more, and coming back with new ideas and coming back with ways to change things, in fact, are being so patted on the back for what they might have said in the public fora, and being so protected by their handlers, that they don't actually get the benefit out of it. Maybe I'm now joining Martin, Bronwyn in being a bit cynical.
Yeah, I've got to echo that. And as I was saying earlier, Alec, I think again one gets exposed, delegation gets exposed to such fantastic ideas, great conversations, debates, meeting these people, but does it feed back into policy and action on this part? Arguably not. And it goes back to, I mean, my sense of the forum the last few years visiting Africa. Yes, last year we held a forum in Abuja in Nigeria. The year before South Africa, and 2013 South Africa, I must say, was very muted. I mean, South Africa's largely fallen off the map. The primary interest amongst global capital is chasing other opportunities in Africa, because we've become a lethargic, slow growth economy, and 1.5%, dare I say 2 in a good year, I'm afraid, is not attractive to anybody. It doesn't motivate anybody. So the South Africa, I would argue, is battling to retain its relevance, not just globally, but depressingly even in the African context. We need to get our act together. The political economy is flawed. This needs to be fixed, and there's a weight of expectation amongst Davos attendees and many others that there needs to be something radically changing.
Alec, if I can just add, I know that we have taken a relatively pessimistic tone, and I don't want that to be misconstrued around the impact of the World Economic Forum and Davos itself, which I think is a fantastic think tank, and I think it has the opportunity and it has the ability to create, as you were saying, more dynamic leaders across both private and government sector, because of what you are exposed to the global thinking, to examples of economies and countries that have been through similar scenarios and how they've problem solved through those difficult times. So I'm not undermining Davos itself, but I think I speak for Martin as well. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been, attending on a regular basis. But it's really, you don't want to taint the World Economic Forum experience with the waning Africa story at the moment. So I think the two need to be separate, and that that policymakers could, and probably even private sector, could do more out of the learnings of Davos, and maybe it's just a game where they've got to become more familiar with the different levels of engagement that they can get exposed to, and then use that to positively impact their scenarios at home.
perhaps, and that's a good way to maybe end, is that it's people like you and I, Bron, and Martin, of course, who are not there to be interviewed, but to be doing the interviewing and absorbing the information, that come back and then try and spread that in a way that is acceptable to, in a format that people who haven't been there can understand, because it really is. It's the most incredible learning experience just to go and just to listen. It is sad, though, and I think this is where we all agree, that we can't get our leaders to perhaps become anonymous at some point, go into those forums and go and have the experience that we have, just to be exposed to the latest developments. But I'm sure a lot of it rubs off, and I'm sure that particularly this whole idea of public-private partnerships is, which has been so successful, and it has been so strongly promoted by the World Economic Forum. Maybe that's one of the things that is being brought home in a strong way. Martin Davies, thank you for joining us on this Google Hangout. Bronwyn Nielsen, as always, it's lovely chatting with you. And thanks for giving us your thoughts. Before we go, though, Martin, maybe a final kind of sum up from your side. We didn't talk much about your area of great expertise, China. They were not in the spotlight, but they were very much there in Davos this year. The China story seems to be continuing, if not quite as aggressively as in the past.
Yeah, Alex, certainly. I think just from your side, from Bronwyn and my side, we're very knowledge-hungry, content-hungry people, and I think Davos certainly gives us that fix. But I think going forward, the emerging market story continues, albeit very different speeds. China leads the way, but as China rebalances from investment-driven to consumer-driven, Africa needs to rebalance as well, from commodity-driven to hopefully investment-driven, and ultimately be self-sustained towards consumer-driven. I think as the world's changing, stating the obvious, Africa needs to change as well. And there's no better place to understand the pace of change, the drivers of change, the impact of change, than a place like Davos.
Ron, your last word?
I'm looking forward to 2016. I've already thrown the gauntlet down to Finance Minister Nene, and I've asked from East Africa, perhaps we can have representation again from Minister Gatete. And then depending on the Nigerian election, if Minister Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala is still in play, then I want a regrouping of the finance ministers on that Davos stage representing the African continent, and I want us to have finally executed on the free movement of goods and people across the free movement of goods, people and services across the African continent. So that is what I'm looking for. I'm going to be driving that agenda, and let's see if we can do it come 2016.
If anybody can do it, Bronwyn, I'm sure it's you. Thank you for this Google Hangout today. It's been great talking to the two of you, and I'm sure we'll do it again, and I'm already looking forward to 2016. I guess that's a good reflection of a successful week, expensive as it was, in the Alps.
Thank you, Alec.
Thanks, Alec.